Why is that? Why is this more the domain of the right? Because I think you're right. I think it's still the case, actually, that there are more people who do what the style of thing that you do, online streaming political debates, who are on the right than on the left.
I think I'm going to broadly appeal to, there's going to be a lot of reasons, but I'm going to broadly appeal to the locus of control, that the farther left you are, the more externalized your situation is. Like if you're on the left, chances are you're where you are because of other things. And then on the right, I think that locus of control is more internal. If you are where you are, it's because of what you've done. And externalizing that locus of control probably leads you to, on some levels positively, probably makes you a bit more empathetic, a little bit more conscientious of other people's circumstances. But it also probably makes you more upset with things, more prone to anger, more hopeless feeling. And then on the right, you probably feel, if with an internal locus of control, you might have a harder time seeing other people's perspectives or understanding why some people don't succeed. But you probably have a personal feeling of great empowerment. You probably feel like you're more in control and in charge of your life. And you can speak with more authority on topics if you don't necessarily, know as much about them, I would say. Broadly speaking, I'd say that's probably the reason.
There may also be a problem of there being more nuance in the positions that you're trying to articulate than the ones that right-wing people are trying to articulate, so it's actually harder to do.
Depends on how far left or right you go, but maybe, right? I don't think there's very much
Well, I mean,
nuance.
you specifically, you're not very far left or right. I mean,
Sure.
I see you trying to tap dance and trying to weave something that I think I do as well, which is to try to weave the most reasonable possible articulation of the point of view that you're presenting, rather than caricaturing the other side.
Yeah.
And that requires a certain nimbleness and a kind of deftness that is probably trickier to pull off than shouting at people and barking slogans.
Yeah. Usually when I'm doing these arguments, I always try to give an example of like the left and the right, so it doesn't sound like I'm just like, oh, like here's a problem that people have, and
Right.
it shows up when they're in favor of having guns and in favor of being pro-life and in favor of capitalism, right? And it sounds like, okay, well you've basically gone to do some research to try to justify why you hate a certain political side.
To be clear, I think the locus of control thing is actually like hugely, hugely interesting. And we've talked about this before. I'm not sure I want to retread the same ground, though. Of course, from what I understand, being a streamer, you have to retread a lot of the same ground. But it seems to be the case that there is that you need both. You need both an internal and external. Like you need to have an internal locus of control, but you also have to understand you need both modes of operating. You need to have an internal locus of control for on a personal level, 1,000%. You need to be in charge of your own destiny, take charge of your own circumstances, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, no, like literally 1,000% you do. But and that's where the conservatives have it right. But they go a little bit too far, and they don't recognize that there can sometimes be structural barriers that we could probably change to make things better. Like for instance, if you're dying of cancer and you're like, oh man, I got cancer. Oh, what am I gonna do? I don't have any money, and I don't have an insurance, or if I do have insurance, it doesn't really matter because fucking insurance is useless in the United States. Well, not don't take that advice. I get insurance, but it's not as helpful as you might think, and it's not like other first world countries where you have universal health care, where it's very generous. So don't actually get insurance. If your company offers it 1,000%, get it. But but you have cancer and you're like, oh well, woe is me, nothing I can do. Whereas like that's obviously you're like, oh well, shit. Where was I gonna go with this? I was going to make a point about how you would as an internal locus of control, like you have to do everything you can to survive, right? So you got cancer, you're gonna want to like try and fight it as best as possible, and you're going to want to like try and like raise money through like your local church or synagogue or mosque or charities or whatever, and try and like raise money to fund for your cancer. And like that's something you should like be like 100% trying to do to the best of your ability. Like go out there and fucking fundraise with the church and get money for your cancer treatments. But you should also have the structural analysis, the liberal part, the progressive part, whatever you want to call it, the left wing view, which is also like, okay, there are structures in society that are probably not great that we can change. So like maybe we should have a society where everyone has healthcare and you don't have to worry about having to fundraise at your local church to fund your cancer treatments. Like maybe that shouldn't be a thing that you have to do in order to survive in a first world country. And that is where the left is correct, but they can also go too far too. They, for instance, what Destiny's talked about. A lot of these left-wing people are basically like shells. They're not even like real humans, barely. Uh, that sounds really bad, but they're like they take no initiative in their own lives, and they think that everything should be handed to them. Like there is a sense of entitlement to that, and they think that no one should ever have to work, right? And like there's some extent, like you could argue that that the way we currently structure things, it's complicated, right? Because you want to have the right balance between creating a society where people feel the need to strive and do better and improve their own circumstance, but also not a society that is treating people greatly unfairly, right? You should, like, for instance, Jim Crow laws in the past, or um, lack of access to health care in the present. Like, people probably, there should be like some baseline level of standard of living that everybody is entitled to just by living in a democracy. And beyond that baseline level, like, you could probably, it should be based on your individual merit, right? So, like, we shouldn't let poor people die from lack of health care. But also, if you're poor, well, we want you to try and pursue a better life. And maybe like what we define as poor should change, and what we view as poor. Like as technology advances and society, the economy becomes more advanced and developed, maybe that standard of living, that floor, the minimum, basic minimum, should raise along with that society. So what constitutes a poor person today, and probably, well, definitely isn't what constituted a poor person 200 years ago, right? 200 years ago, everyone was poor, except for like, kings and queens. But even today, the poorest people on Earth today have a higher standard of living than, well, the poorest people in America, at least I don't know about Earth. The poorest people in America today have a higher standard of living than the top 5% or top 1% 100, 200 years ago. 200 years ago for sure, 1,000%. Not even, no question whatsoever. 100 years ago, it's more complicated. Um, but the standard of living has changed drastically, and the floor has changed along with it. And that's probably positive. And I don't, and conservatives, they might want to keep things exactly how they are now forever. But that's probably not ideal. Like, as technology advances, 100 years from now, we probably should have a higher standard of living and a higher baseline level for every person, because we can meet those standards much easier. It's doable, so why not do it? It would seem kind of cruel to be like, well, we could have health care for everyone, and we could have no poverty, and we could have like a Star Trek style fucking Federation utopia, but we don't really want to, because we want the poor people to suffer. Like it just doesn't make any sense. But you need to have like a healthy balance, and that's something that people on the left and right don't seem to understand, which is why they are drawn to like these crazy ideologies that are extremist.